What happens when an entitled duchess meets a comedian who refuses to play by royal rules? The answer will shock you, and by the end of this video you'll understand why Hollywood insiders are calling this the most explosive late-night television moment in recent memory. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story gets absolutely wild. The green room at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy. Makeup artists rushed between guests. Producers checked their clipboards for the 100th time, and the familiar hum of Hollywood machinery filled the air. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Meghan Markle was scheduled to appear, and everyone could sense the tension crackling through the building like electricity before a storm. "She's been in hair and Meghan Markle makeup for 3 hours," whispered one production assistant to another. 3 hours and she's still not happy with how she looks. Jimmy Kimmel himself was pacing in his dressing room, running through his notes one final time. He'd interviewed countless celebrities, politicians, and public figures. But something about this booking felt off. His producers had been unusually tight-lipped about the interview details, and the list of topics Meghan's team had deemed off limits was longer than most guest contracts he'd ever seen. "Jimmy, we need to talk." His head producer, Janet, appeared in the doorway looking frazzled. "There's been a situation with the Duchess." "What kind of situation?" Jimmy asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his stomach. "She's demanding we reshoot her entrance 3 times because the lighting isn't flattering enough. She also wants us to change the coffee table because she says the wood grain is too distracting." And audience members, Janet paused, clearly dreading what came next. "She's insisting we provide her with a list of audience members so she can approve who gets to ask questions during the Q&A segment." Jimmy stopped pacing. "We don't have a Q&A segment. That's what I told her team." Apparently, she assumed we'd add one specifically for her. Before Jimmy could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the hallway through the thin walls. They could hear Meghan's unmistakable voice, sharp with frustration. "This is completely unacceptable. Do you people have any idea who I am? I'm not some reality TV star looking for 15 minutes of fame. I'm a member of the British royal family, and I expect to be treated with the respect that position demands." A production assistant's nervous voice replied, "Mom, we completely understand, but the show starts in 20 minutes and we really need to get you to the set for final checks." "Final checks?" Meghan's voice rose, Meghan's voice in octave. "I haven't even approved the final lighting setup. And what's this I hear about Jimmy planning to ask me about my family? That's completely off limits. And my team made that crystal clear." Weeks ago, Jimmy exchanged a look with Janet. His interview prep had included several questions about Meghan's relationship with her father and her experience joining the royal family, standard topics for any celebrity interview. But apparently, Meghan's definition of off-limits was far more expansive than anyone had anticipated. "Maybe I should go talk to her," Jimmy suggested, already dreading the conversation. "Good luck," Janet muttered. "She's in full Duchess mode." Jimmy made his way down the hallway toward the green room, passing several crew members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The closer he got, the clearer Meghan's voice became. And another thing she was saying to what sounded like her entire entourage. "I specifically requested that the interview be conducted sitting down. Standing interviews are beneath my station. I'm not a game show contestant." Jimmy knocked gently on the green room door. "Meghan, it's Jimmy. Mind if I come?" Meghan enters in. The room fell silent for a moment before Meghan's voice called out, "Of course, Jimmy, please come in." When Jimmy entered, he found Meghan surrounded by what appeared to be half a dozen handlers, stylists, and assistants. She was seated in the center like a queen holding court, her posture rigid and her expression stern. The transformation from the warm, relatable actress he remembered from her earlier career was striking. "Jimmy," Meghan said, rising gracefully from her chair, "we need to discuss some changes to tonight's format." "Changes?" Jimmy kept his voice light, though he could feel the familiar pre-show jitters intensifying. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" Meghan gestured to one of her assistants, who immediately produced a tablet loaded with notes. "First, I'll need you to introduce me as Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex, not just Meghan Markle. The proper title is essential." Jimmy nodded slowly. "Okay, I can work with that. What else?" Second, I understand you plan to ask about my father and my relationship with the press. Those topics are completely forbidden. Instead, I'd like you to focus on my humanitarian work and my upcoming projects. I have a list of approved talking points right here. She handed him a sheet of paper that looked more like a corporate press release than interview notes. Jimmy scanned it, quickly, his heart sinking. Every suggested question was essentially a softball designed to make her look flawless. Meghan, Jimmy said carefully, I appreciate you wanting to stay on message, but our audience expects a row. Audience expectations, conversation. These questions are they're pretty safe. People tune in to see celebrities being genuine, having fun, maybe even being a little vulnerable. Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly. Vulnerable. Jimmy, I think you're misunderstanding what kind of interview this is. I'm not here to provide entertainment for your audience. I'm here to share my message and represent my brand appropriately. Your brand? Jimmy couldn't hide his surprise. I thought you were here to promote your charity work and connect with people. Everything I do is part of building my platform, Meghan replied matter-of-factly. Every appearance, every interview, every public moment is carefully curated to serve a larger purpose. I assumed you understood that. Jimmy felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't the collaborative, fun-loving celebrity interview he prepared for. This was turning into something else entirely. Something that felt more like a business negotiation than a conversation. Look, business negotiation, Jimmy said, trying to find middle ground. I want you to feel comfortable out there, but I also have to give my audience what they're expecting. How about we compromise? We'll stick to topics you're comfortable with, but let's keep the conversation natural, okay? No scripted questions, no predetermined answers. Just two people talking. Meghan's expression hardened. Jimmy, I don't think you're grasping the situation here. I'm not just any guest. I'm royalty and I expect to be treated accordingly. That means following my team's guidelines exactly as they've been laid out. No deviations, no surprises, no attempts at humor at my expense. The room fell silent. Jimmy could feel the eyes of every crew member on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. In all his years of hosting, he'd never encountered a guest who seemed so determined to control every aspect of a crossroads, the interview. Jimmy took a deep breath, realizing he was at a crossroads. He could either capitulate to every demand and deliver a boring, sanitized interview that would disappoint his audience, or he could do what he'd always done, treat every guest with respect but maintain the integrity of his show. Meghan, he said finally, I respect your position, but I also have a responsibility to my viewers. They trust me to have genuine conversations with my guests. If we script everything, we're not being honest with them. Meghan's assistant immediately stepped forward. Mr. Kimmel, perhaps we should clarify something. Her Royal Highness has very specific expectations for this appearance. Any deviation from the agreed-upon parameters could result in serious consequences for your production. Consequences? Jimmy raised an eyebrow. What kind of consequences are we talking about here? Meghan herself, consequences, answered, her voice taking on a tone that Jimmy had never heard from a guest before. Jimmy, I have a substantial social media following and significant influence in certain circles. If this interview doesn't meet my standards, I can't guarantee what kind of coverage it will receive afterward. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Jimmy felt his jaw tighten. In 20 years of television, no guest had ever tried to leverage their influence against him so blatantly. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that his crew knew meant trouble. I'm simply explaining reality, Meghan replied smoothly. This is how things work at my level. Everything is strategic, everything has consequences, and everyone needs to understand their role in the larger picture. Jimmy looked around the room at his staff, all of whom were watching this exchange with a mixture of fascination and horror. These staff reaction were people he'd worked with for years, professionals who'd seen him handle difficult guests, technical disasters, and live television emergencies. But none of them had ever witnessed anything quite like this. Okay, Jimmy said, his decision made. Here's what we're going to do. The show starts in 10 minutes. We're going to go out there and we're going to have a conversation. I'll be respectful. I'll be professional. And I'll treat you exactly like I treat every other guest. If that's not acceptable to you, you're welcome to leave right now. Meghan's eyes flashed with something Jimmy couldn't quite identify. surprise, anger. She wasn't used to being challenged. That much was clear. "You're making a mistake, Jimmy," she said quietly. "I came here as a courtesy to give your little show some credibility by association. But if you can't appreciate what I'm offering, then perhaps we don't have anything to backstage drama discuss your call," Jimmy replied, already turning toward the door. "But if you're staying, we go live in 8 minutes." As Jimmy left the green room, he could hear Meghan's team erupting into urgent, whispered conversations behind him. He made his way to the stage where his band and crew were making final preparations. The audience was seated and excited, completely unaware of the drama unfolding backstage. "How'd it go?" Janet asked as soon as she saw Jimmy's expression. "About as well as you'd expect," Jimmy replied grimly. "Is she coming out or not?" "Her team just confirmed she'll do the interview," Janet said, checking her headset. "But Jimmy, they're really not happy. They've been making phone calls for the last 5 minutes." "Let them make their calls," Jimmy said, straightening his tie. "We've Meghan's entrance got a show to do." The familiar countdown began, and Jimmy felt the rush of adrenaline that always came with live television. Whatever happened next, it was going to be memorable. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle." The audience erupted in applause as Meghan made her entrance. To her credit, she was a consummate professional when the cameras were rolling. Her smile was radiant. Her wave was perfectly timed, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who'd been trained for exactly this moment. But Jimmy could see the tension in her shoulders, slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she was still furious about their backstage confrontation. "Meghan, thank you so much for being here," Jimmy said as she settled into the guest chair. "It's great to see you." "Thank you for having me, Jimmy," Meghan replied, her public persona now fully activated. "I'm thrilled to be here." "So, let's start with the obvious question," Jimmy began, settling into his interviewing rhythm. "You've had quite a journey over the past few years, from Hollywood actress to British royalty to, well, whatever we're calling your current situation. How are you processing all of that change?" Jimmy had deliberately chosen a broad, open-ended question that would allow Meghan to steer the conversation wherever she felt comfortable. It was exactly the kind of respectful but engaging approach he'd perfected over decades of interviewing. But instead of the warm, reflective answer he expected, Meghan's response was surprisingly sharp. "Well, Jimmy, I think it's important to be precise about language here. I'm not processing anything because there's nothing to process. I've made deliberate, strategic decisions about my life and my career, and I'm exactly where I intended to be." The audience sensed something was off. The usual chemistry between host and guest wasn't there, and Meghan's answer felt more like a corporate statement than a personal reflection. Jimmy tried again. "Sure, I understand that, but surely there have been some unexpected challenges along the way. Some moments where you've had to adapt or learn something new about yourself, Jimmy," Meghan said, her smile never wavering, but her voice taking on that same controlled tone from the green room. "I think you might be operating under some misconceptions about my story. I didn't stumble into my current position. I didn't have to adapt because I was already prepared. Everything that's happened has been part of a carefully planned trajectory." Jimmy felt the interview slipping away from him. Meghan was determined to stay in complete control, even if it meant delivering answers that were robotic and unsatisfying. "Okay," he said, trying a different approach. "Let's talk about your humanitarian work then. You've been involved with several causes over the years. What drives that passion for you?" "I'm glad you asked," Meghan replied, and Jimmy could practically see her shifting into prepared talking point mode. "My platform provides me with a unique opportunity to amplify important messages and create meaningful change. Through strategic partnerships and carefully curated initiatives, I'm able to leverage my influence for maximum impact." Jimmy blinked. She was speaking like a business consultant, not like someone discussing work she was passionate about. The audience was growing restless. He could feel it. Jimmy decided to try one more time to break through the wall of corporate speak and connect with whatever was left of the person behind the Duchess persona. "You know what, Meghan," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Can I ask you something a little more personal? Our audience loves getting to know the real person behind the public image. What makes you laugh?" What's something that happened recently that genuinely surprised you? For a split second, Meghan doubled down, thought he saw something flicker across Meghan's face, but instead of opening up, she doubled down on her defensive posture. Jimmy, I appreciate the question, but I think you're misunderstanding why I'm here tonight. This isn't a therapy session or a girls' night out. I'm here to discuss serious topics with the gravity they deserve. Perhaps we could focus on my upcoming initiatives rather than trying to manufacture some artificial moment of vulnerability for your viewers. The studio fell silent. Entertainment. The studio fell silent. Even the band members exchanged glances. Jimmy had interviewed thousands of people and he'd never had a guest essentially lecture him about his own interview style on live television. Manufactured vulnerability. Jimmy repeated, his professional composure finally beginning to crack. Meghan, I'm trying to have a conversation with you. That's what we do here. We talk to interesting people about their lives, their work, their experiences. I'm not trying to manufacture anything. But you are, Meghan insisted, her voice rising slightly. You're trying to get me to perform some version of relatability that serves your show's format. You want, I'm not an actress, me to be charming and self-deprecating and grateful for the opportunity to be here, but that's not who I am anymore, Jimmy. I'm not an actress looking for approval. I'm a global influencer with serious responsibilities. Jimmy felt something snap inside him. The respectful patience he'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal suddenly evaporated. Global influencer, he said, his voice taken on the edge. That, regular viewers knew, meant he was about to drop the gloves. Meghan, you're a guest on a talk show. You agreed to come here and have a conversation. If you didn't want to actually talk to me, why did you book the appearance? I booked this appearance, Meghan shot back. All pretense of media training abandoning her because my team thought it would be beneficial for my brand. But clearly, your questions are pedestrian. This show isn't the right platform for someone at my level. Your questions are pedestrian. Your approach is outdated, and frankly, I'm not sure your audience is sophisticated enough to understand the work I'm doing. The audience gasped audibly. Jimmy sat back in his chair, genuinely stunned. In 20 years of television, he'd never had a guest insult his viewers to their faces. Did you just call my audience unsophisticated? Jimmy asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm simply observing that different platforms serve different demographics. Meghan replied, apparently oblivious to the hole she was digging. Your show caters to a certain, let's say, mainstream sensibility. My message requires a more elevated discourse. Jimmy looked out at his audience. People who'd taken time out of their evening to come support his show. People who'd been excited to see Meghan Markle. People who were now watching her dismiss them as intellectually inferior. You know what, Meghan, Jimmy said, standing up from his desk. I think you're right. I don't think this is the right platform for you. Meghan looked confused for the first time all evening. What do you mean? I mean, Jimmy continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally reached his limit. If you think my show is beneath you, if you think my audience isn't smart enough to appreciate your message, then maybe you should find somewhere else to share it. I'm telling you to leave. Are you asking me to leave? Meghan asked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I'm telling you to leave. Jimmy replied firmly. This is my show. These are my people, and I'm not going to sit here and let you insult them while pretending you're doing us a favor by being here. Meghan stood up abruptly, her microphone pack pulling taut. Do you have any idea what you're doing, Jimmy? Do you understand the consequences of treating me this way? There go the consequences again, Jimmy said, shaking his head. You know what the consequence is going to be, Meghan. Tomorrow, people are going to remember that you came on television and acted like you were too good for everyone in this room. That's your consequence. You're making the biggest mistake of your career. Meghan hissed, no, you're making the biggest mistake of your career. Longer caring about the cameras or the audience or her public image. I have more influence than you could possibly imagine. I can make sure this follows you everywhere you go. Jimmy walked around his desk and stood directly in front of her. Are you threatening me again on live television? In front of all these witnesses? I don't make threats, Jimmy. I make promises. The audience was on the edge of their seats, watching what was clearly an unprecedented moment in late-night television history. Jimmy's band members had stopped pretending to shuffle through their music. The camera operators were getting everything, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. Security, "Jimmy, you cannot do this to me," called out, his voice carrying across the studio. "Please escort Ms. Markle from the building. You cannot do this to me," Meghan shouted as two security guards approached. "Do you know who I am? I'm royalty. You cannot treat royalty this way. You're not in England anymore," Jimmy replied calmly. "And even if you were, queens are supposed to be gracious to their subjects, not the other way around." As security gently but firmly guided Meghan toward the exit, she continued her tirade. "This is assault. This is discrimination. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to sue this network. I'm going to destroy your career." Jimmy turned to face his audience, who erupted in spontaneous applause. He waited for the cheering to die down before speaking. "Well, folks," he said with a wary smile, "that's definitely a first. In 20 years of doing this show, I've never had to ask a guest to leave. But you know what? Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to come into our house and disrespect you people. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason any of this matters, and anyone who doesn't understand that can find the door." The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. When it finally quieted, Jimmy looked the end of the show directly into the camera. "We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have some actual fun with people who remember that entertainment is supposed to be, well, entertaining." As the show cut to commercial, Jimmy could still hear Meghan's voice echoing from the hallway, apparently still arguing with security about proper protocols for handling royalty. He shook his head and laughed, knowing that this moment would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The Duchess had finally met someone who refused to bow, and the result was everything his audience could have hoped for, and more. So, what do you think? Was Jimmy right to kick Meghan off his show, or should he have handled the situation differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think was right in this argument? Comment below.